What's up and welcome for the first time to my channel. If you notice that the lighting's kind of bad, or I'm out of focus for this entire video, or I sound like I'm talking to you from the bottom of a well, then it's just because I don't know what I'm doing. But somebody told me that if you want to make video content, then you kind of just gotta go for it. And so this is me going for it. Wish me luck. Just hit subscribe, ring the bell. I don't know what it does, but it can't hurt, right? Up until yesterday, PlayStation was planning on having their PlayStation 5 reveal event later this week, but because of the way things are going in this country right now, they've delayed it indefinitely, which, on top of being almost certainly the right call, also gives me more time to make this video. And with the next generation of consoles right around the corner, I figured that now is the ideal time to take a look back at how our current generation got started. On February 20th, 2013, PlayStation held the PlayStation Meeting. Not the most creatively named event, but it was where they showed off the PlayStation 4 for the first time. It started with about 12 minutes of preamble, where Andrew House came out and basically tried to re-establish the credibility of PlayStation as a brand, which I don't think was necessary, but given the way the PlayStation 3 generation had gone, it couldn't hurt. After this, though, they get straight into the meat and potatoes of the event, bringing Mark Cerny out to talk about the hardware. Which he only kind of does. He talks in broad strokes about the features that the console is going to have without actually talking about the parts or the inner workings of the machine itself. He does at one point show a splash screen of icons that seems to demonstrate what the PlayStation 4 is capable of, but it doesn't actually say anything of value. He also shows off a PlayStation camera, which would not end up being particularly used until the VR headset came out several years later. After Mark is done talking about the hardware, he goes on to try and introduce some tech demos, but he can't do that until he shows off the new controller. It's not massively different from the DualShock 3, in fact there's really only 3 changes. There's a light bar on the front, which would come to be a problem for the battery life, a touchpad in the middle, which would end up just becoming a glorified start button in most games, and a share button, which is the reason why there needed to be a new start button. After we see the controller, he goes right into those tech demos though. We get an Unreal 4 tech demo, which is very similar to how we've seen an Unreal 5 tech demo from them recently. And then we get a relatively famous tech demo where he drops 1,000,000 blue balls on a city and just sort of lets physics take over. But what's next is the real star of the tech demo portion of this show. Knack. The fact that they show Knack here in the show as opposed to later when they're showing games back to back says to me that they really intended it to be more of a tech demo than a proper game. But then the trailer that they show focuses more on the cinematic aspect and the story of the game, so it's a little bit confusing. Mark then finishes off with a couple more features of the PS4 like sharing before introducing David Perry, the CEO of Gaikai. If you don't recognize the name, it's probably because Gaikai didn't really do a whole lot outside of this event. In fact, now I think they're really just the backbone of PlayStation Now, but the name isn't even associated. And what's more, is Perry goes on to describe a number of features that Gaikai could potentially bring to the PlayStation 4, none of which I think end up being used. Features like being able to immediately play a demo off the store without having to download anything, or being able to hand over your controller through the internet to a friend so that they could beat a level for you. And weirdly, he even talks about a feature where the store will predict what games you're going to play and start downloading them before you hit buy. Which feels a little intrusive, and given the storage size of the PlayStation 4, it's definitely a good thing that that didn't end up being real.
If we know enough about you to predict the next game you'll purchase, then that game can be loaded and ready to go before you even click the buy button.
Our long-term goal is to make every PlayStation 4 title playable on the PS Vita. I mean, the technology is so advanced that someday we could easily put PS1, PS2, PS3, and the PS Mobile games on any device, including the PlayStation 4.
They then transition into a new video package. Visually, it's really cool. It's a sort of papercraft thing where a number of devs are talking about how they can work with the PS4 now. This is an important thing to have because during the PS3 generation, the cell architecture made it nearly impossible for certain devs to work with the system. It is funny though, the people that they choose to focus on in this video package are the likes of Tim Schafer and Tamim from Ninja Theory, who are both now Microsoft first-party employees, Stig, who at the time was working for Sony Santa Monica but now works for Respawn, David Cage, who no longer makes PlayStation-exclusive titles, and Randy Pitchford, who has been in the news recently for all the wrong reasons. While this video package is really cool, it doesn't really say anything of substance, which means we're now 45 minutes into this 2-hour show, and the most interesting thing that we've seen is knack. Fortunately, Michael Denny from Worldwide Studios comes out to turn this ship around. He acts as a transition to Herman Holst, who at the time was the head of Guerrilla Games, but is now the head of all of PlayStation Studios. And he's here to introduce Killzone Shadowfall, a launch title for the PlayStation 4. And it's really funny rewatching this trailer after so many years. It reminds me how at the time so many games thought that the most visually stunning thing that they could do was cover the screen in blue and orange. In fact, at one point you're shown that there's a wall separating the two factions of the game, and on one side it's orange and the other it's blue. That being said, this trailer is great. Suspiciously great. And after a little bit of research, it turned out that it was actually just a bullshot. So much so that PlayStation actually ended up having to take a settlement outside of court because they faced a lawsuit about it. But once Herman is done bullshotting us, he transitions into Drive Club. Racing games are uniquely popular during new console launches because you can really put the full power behind what the cars look like without having to worry about things like animation or the uncanny valley. In fact, really the only negative that I have about this section is that the guy presenting gets a little creepy about describing these cars,
causing them to reflect light differently when they've been brushed or touched. The exquisite feeling of opening the door, breathing in the experience, strapping yourself in, and firing up a 1200 brake horsepower engine. We've gone borderline insane.
Like maybe he's a little too into cars. The next presenter is from Sucker Punch. He's here to talk about Infamous Second Son, which is definitely the best Infamous game and probably the best launch window title for the PS4. But this presentation gets really real, really fast.
In 1999, I took part in a political rally and got tear gassed by the cops. Now, up until then, I'd always thought the police were there to protect me, to protect the people that I cared about. But on that day, they didn't.
It was really weird to watch this in 2020, given what's happening in the country right now. That being said, this is probably the best moment of the night. Troy Baker's acting in this trailer is a good foreshadow for what PlayStation first-party studios are going to become known for over the next couple years. And the particle effects, the visuals, everything about this trailer is completely on point, which left me, even now in 2020, legitimately wanting to go back and replay this game. After this, Denny comes back out to introduce Jonathan Blow and The Witness. If you don't remember, The Witness is an open-world puzzle game. It's legitimately a really good game, but I don't know that it's doing the PlayStation 4 any favors at a hardware reveal event because nothing about it is particularly demanding or impressive on that level. That being said, I'm glad that it's here. It shows a wider variety in the games that you can expect to play on the PlayStation 4, which is something that they've come under fire recently for because of how many of their games fall into that same genre of third-person action-adventure. But then Denny's back, and he's here to take away the fun and say that all the next sections aren't going to be about games, before transitioning to everyone's favorite, David Cage. With Detroit Become Human still not yet ready to be announced, he doesn't really have a whole lot to talk about, so he just goes on for like 5 minutes about polygons and emotion. It's good though, because talking about the polygons gives a good idea of how far the industry has come over the years as far as tech is concerned, and then talking about emotion gives an example of what that tech can do. And when you look at more recent PS4 games, you can see that they're definitely making use of it in that way. Alex Evans from Media Molecule is up next, and it's weird because even though we were expressly told that the next couple sections weren't going to be about games, he talks about dreams. But he doesn't talk about it as a game, he just shows off like a sculpting tool, and he talks about it as a creative platform and how the PlayStation 4 is going to make it possible for creators to be more creative. But he's clearly showing what we will come to know as Dreams the game. And he even says Dreams multiple times during his presentation, which leaves me in a weird chicken and egg situation where it's hard to tell whether or not he's already planning on making Dreams and this is just a showcase of the tech, or if he made this showcase of tech and then fell in love with it and turned it into a game. We're about 3/4 of the way through the show at this point, and it's been a really good mix of things. We've gotten a solid amount of games that looked pretty impressive, although one would turn out to be less impressive than we thought. We got a lot of talk about the hardware and architecture, although we didn't really go into specifics. And we got a good amount of talk about what we can expect the PS4 to have in terms of features, although many of them ended up not happening. We're on the home stretch now, and Andrew House comes back out to introduce the fourth section of the show, which I'm going to title Third Party. First, House brings out Yoshinori Ono from Capcom. He's here to talk about how Capcom has evolved over the years, and he uses PlayStation Generations as a framework to do so. This serves the same purpose as David Cage's talk about polygons, but it's infinitely more interesting. And then he immediately goes on to show off a game and a new engine. The engine is Pantaray, which to my knowledge never ended up being used. And the game is Deep Down, which, although never being cancelled, we haven't heard about in a very long time. We then get Yoshihisa Hashimoto from Square Enix, and he's here to show off another tech demo, which at this point feels a little redundant, because we've already seen multiple tech demos, and it's especially weird to see one coming from a third party who you would expect to be showing off a game. He does then toss to another Hashimoto from Square Enix, who declares that they're working on a new Final Fantasy, but he doesn't show so much as a title screen, which is really weird when you consider that later this very year at Sony's E3 conference, they're going to announce Final Fantasy 15. So why even mention it if you're not going to have anything to show? We then get Yves Guillemot from Ubisoft. And he just talks for a minute about how Ubisoft has always tried to be there at the launch of new tech, and how this generation will be no different before transitioning to Jonathan Morin with Watch Dogs. It's actually funny. Yves is like on point with his timing. He comes out at exactly 1 hour 43 minutes, and he is done at exactly 1 hour 45 minutes. Anyway, Watch Dogs. Morin just talks for a minute about how technology is advancing in such a way that hackers would have all the power, etc., before showing a trailer for Watch Dogs, which is nearly a complete fabrication. It shows not only visuals that are in no way representative of the final product, but also entire features that aren't in the game. Anyway, after this we get a big hype up moment about how the next presenter is somebody who's never been on stage for a console before. It's Blizzard, here to show off that Diablo 3 is going to be on consoles now. But he doesn't show any gameplay, and all we get is a logo, so there's really not a whole lot to talk about here. Andrew House comes out to introduce the last presenter, and it's actually kind of funny because he's been coming out for between every single presenter of the third party section. And so at this point he comes out just like, yeah, it's me again.
Yes, it's me again. Now,
But regardless, the last presenter is a big deal. It's Bungie. They're here to talk about Destiny. And regardless of your opinion on Destiny's quality, there's no arguing that it's a huge deal for Bungie to be on stage at a PlayStation event. Up until now, they've been a Microsoft first-party studio for over a decade. So them being here is a big get for Sony. And I think Sony knows it, because at one point they bring out like all the higher-ups of Bungie to just stand on stage and not say anything for a minute, just to be like, yeah, they're here. They're here on PlayStation now. After Destiny is done, it's just a quick sizzle reel into the ending of the show. And this show has been really good, at least at the time. At the time, you would look at this and you would say, wow, these are some amazing games. These features are impressive. Everything is so good. PlayStation really knocked it out of the park. But when you look back at it from 2020, it's kind of a different story. 2 of the games were major bullshots, one of which actually resulted in a lawsuit. A third game may or may not exist. A large number of the features they talked about for the system were never implemented. And what's more is we've gotten all the way through this hardware reveal event without seeing the console or being given specifics about the parts inside it, which I would think would be the whole point. Either way though, it's not going to end up mattering because of what happens next. Not long after the PlayStation 4 reveal event, there was a leak from Microsoft. Some design documents that outlined a lot of the things that people would come to hate about the Xbox One's reveal. Things like always online DRM, inability to trade in your games, inability to share your games. A lot of really big ticket things got completely leaked before Microsoft had a chance to introduce them themselves. And what's worse is that the PlayStation event was in February, and we didn't hear from Xbox in an official capacity until the reveal event in May. Meaning there were multiple months of people being able to speculate and twist these things into the worst possible scenario. and Microsoft didn't really do anything to clarify it. Meaning that by the time we got to the Xbox One reveal event, people were already so pissed off that they weren't really willing to listen to anything Xbox had to say unless it was about these events. And Microsoft didn't say anything. May 21st, 2013, Xbox held their own reveal event, and it was kind of rough. The Xbox event started a lot like the PlayStation one, with a lengthy preamble featuring the likes of Bill Gates and Kudo Tsunoda and Cliffy B, and some surprising faces even, like Steven Spielberg and J.J. Abrams for some reason. But after that, Don Matrick took the stage and he had two orders of business. The first was to give a fairly long-winded explanation as to the mission statement of the Xbox One, and the second was to show off the actual console. And the console looked good. They gave it a sleek intro video. They showed off the controller and the new Kinect. Up until this point, in a vacuum, this presentation is going very well. After Don is done introducing the box, he brings out Yusuf Mehdi to talk about the box's features. He starts by showing off some Kinect gestures and the dashboard itself, and again, everything is looking fine. It's actually kind of neat. When he's showing off the gestures on the screen, the piece of media that he's manipulating with them is Star Trek, where they're constantly doing wild gestures to do science things on nondescript terminals. But then he says TV. The next 8 minutes of the show are still him just talking about features of the Xbox. But now that he said TV, people have stopped listening. Even though he's showing pretty cool features like being able to quickly switch between applications, because one of the applications he's switching to is TV, people aren't listening. Because when Yusuf shows the snapping feature, he does it by snapping fantasy stats over an NBA game, people aren't listening. He goes on to show off some actual TV features like a TV guide and a partnership with ESPN, but because he was using TV as an example for the features earlier, people felt like this entire block was just about television. The next person up to the stage is Mark Whitten. He's here to talk about the actual hardware, and he does a pretty good job of it. He spends about 7 minutes talking about the interactivity between the console and the controller and Smart Glass and Xbox Live itself. He then goes into specifics about the actual parts inside the box, giving us hard numbers on what we can expect from the system, which seems really important for a console launch event, and yet we didn't get it from PlayStation.
All while delivering practically silent operation.
After all this hardware talk and features and TV, we are 27 minutes into this show, and it's finally time for us to see a game. But it's not the most exciting game. They bring out Andrew Wilson from EA to talk about EA Sports. He talks for a while about the Ignite engine, which seems to primarily focus on the motion of players and the collision between them. We get a video package of athletes talking, and then a quick clip show of a couple of games. We see Madden, FIFA, UFC, NBA, and it's all exactly what you would expect all of those things to look like, with zero surprises. At this point in the show, that remember, people came into already pissed off. People are exhausted. We've just seen 30 minutes of hardware numbers and a little bit of TV and a little bit of EA Sports, and none of it is really blowing people's skirts up. So when Phil Spencer comes out to show off some actual games, people are already done with the show. He shows off Forza Motorsport 5, and again, racing games are extremely popular at a console launch because of how comparatively easy it is to make them look great. He then shows off Quantum Break from Remedy Games, and despite the fact that this game is very good, because it had a television tie-in element, it just became one more drop in the bucket for the TV crowd. He also promises that within the first year of the Xbox One's life, there will be 15 exclusives, a lot of which end up being shown off at E3 the next month. When Phil Spencer is done showing off these games, he introduces Nancy Tellem. Nancy talks some fluff for a minute before bringing out Bonnie Ross from 343 to make the real announcement, that there's going to be a Halo TV show helmed by Steven Spielberg, which 7 years later is still in production but feels no closer to coming out. In any other show, this would be a legitimately exciting announcement. A Halo show sounds really cool, and I'd be super thrilled to watch it, but because almost everything else in this entire showcase has been so dry, it's just one more not game. Afterwards, we're treated to another dose of Don Matrick, who basically just gives us a recap of what we've already seen before bringing out Activision with Call of Duty. He talks for a minute about Call of Duty before transitioning into a very lengthy video package describing how they mocapped a dog and how the fish will move out of your way, but it's really nothing of particular substance, and this is what ends the show. This show led to a lot of complaints, some of which were absolutely founded, and others make no sense to me whatsoever. To start with, Microsoft did absolutely nothing during this conference to clarify or make better the things that had leaked. They did nothing to talk about DRM, they did nothing to talk about sharing games, and it had already been months of people being legitimately angry and concerned about this. You would think that that would be the first thing that they did, but they didn't do it at all. The second major complaint, and the one that gets brought up the most often even now in 2020, is TV. Even to this day, games journalists still refer to this conference as the TV conference.
The TV event?
TV.
And it's not entirely accurate. If you break down the things talked about during this conference, you wind up with about 24 minutes on features and hardware, about 26 minutes on games, and only about 13 and a half minutes on TV and TV features. By far the smallest category. What's more is that this is neither the first time nor the last time that people would talk about television during a video game conference. To get proof of this, all you have to do is look at the E3 conferences. Microsoft 2005 when they were announcing the Xbox 360, Microsoft 2011, Microsoft 2012, and of course here, Microsoft 2013. And you might be saying, so what, Microsoft has made this mistake before, surely no one else would do it. But let's look over at Sony then. PlayStation has talked about television in even more conferences than Microsoft. They talked about it in 2003, 2004, 2006, 2008, 2011, 2012, 2013, this very year, 2014, and still in 2015, meaning that they were not only the first people to talk about television in a video game conference, but also the most recent people to talk about television in a video game conference. So why is it then that Microsoft gets all the blame for talking about television? Well, it's because they didn't do anything to distract from it. In all of these other conferences, there are multiple games and interesting features and tons of stuff to focus on. But because people came into this conference already pissed off about all the leaks and the DRM and the not being able to share your games, they latched onto this as just another fault, another thing to throw in Microsoft's face. While I do think that this conference, even without that, is significantly worse than the PlayStation 4 reveal event, there are certain things that it does significantly better. It actually showed off the box. They actually talked about the hard numbers of the parts going into it, both of which are things that are extremely important for a hardware reveal event. They saved most of their games for E3, which, considering it was only a couple weeks after this, is not the biggest of deals. The real problem here was a distinct lack of clarity. If those leaks hadn't happened prior to this event, it would have just been a mediocre conference and people would have been willing to wait until E3. But because they happened, because people already knew about the DRM, because people already knew about not being able to share your games, and because they did absolutely nothing to clarify any of that during this conference, people were extremely pissed off, and rightfully so. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments down below. Whether you agree or disagree, or you just have ideas on how I can improve the show, I want to hear all of it. I'll cover both companies' E3 2013 conferences, as well as how they've reacted in the years since, in a part 2 to this video. But anyway, until part 2, I'll see you next time.
Technology and how we use it. Every major console, all the way from the Atari 2600, which was the dominant console when I started in games some 30-something years ago, all the way up through the PlayStation 2, had pretty much been a single-purpose device. Insert the cartridge, the CD, the DVD, power it on, play your game. That's all they did, and that was fine. That was the world we lived in then. But at the time of the launch of the PlayStation 3, all of that was in flux. The world was becoming a connected place, and a single device was now expected to provide a range of services and applications. Now, PS3 has done pretty well in these respects. It's the top platform for Netflix.